My name is Carlos de la Riva, and I will present the British invasion of the River Plate in 1806 to 1807, based on the book by Ben Hughes, published in 2013. The South Sea Company was granted the commercial privilege of exclusive trade rights to the Spanish Indies in Latin America. Buenos Aires had been relatively neglected by Spain, which sent most of its ships to the economically important city of Lima. The British had long harboured ambitions in South America, considering the estuary of the Rio de la Plata as the most favourable location for a British colony. In 1789, war between Great Britain and Spain seemed imminent after the Nootka crisis, revolving around sovereignty and rights of navigation and trade. Francisco de Miranda used the opportunity to strike against Spain and approached William Pitt with his proposal to help emancipate the New World territories under Spanish colonial rule. The plan requested the assistance of Great Britain and the United States to occupy the major South American cities. Pitt accepted the proposal and began to organize the expedition, but as the Nootka Convention in 1790 ended hostilities and Spain agreed to abandon its claims to the North Pacific coast, the Miranda mission was cancelled. Nicholas Vansittart, Lord Bexley, made a new proposal in 1796. The plan was to take Buenos Aires. The proposal was cancelled the following year, but was improved by Thomas Maitland in 1800 as the Maitland Plan, to seize control of Buenos Aires with 4,000 soldiers and 1,500 cavalry. All such proposals were discussed again in 1804 by William Pitt, Henry Dundas, Francisco de Miranda, and Home Riggs Popham. Popham did not believe a complete military occupation of South America was practical, but argued for taking control of key locations to allow the main objective to open new markets for the British economy. William Pitt, in 1805, commissioned the study of a military plan proposed by Francisco de Miranda to the British government. But Popham instead reasoned with the authorities that, as the Spanish colonies were discontented and considering sedition, it would be easy to promote a rising with build-up of tension and conflict in Buenos Aires. But because the Franco-Netherlands-Dutch alliance of 1806 threatened British interest in South Africa and led to the collapse of the Peace Treaty of Amiens, the British plans for the Miranda invasion were dropped, and instead Davy Baird was sent to seize the Cape. A British squadron composed of 3 64-gun ships, 1 50-gun ship, and 4 frigates and sloops, under Sir Home Popham, having in charge a fleet of transports and Indiamen containing about 6,000 troops, commanded by Major General Sir David Baird, sailed from England. These were the vessels under the command of Commodore Popham and the captains of the other ships. Popham expanded Howe's telegraphic signals or marine vocabulary and developed the world's first alphabetical flag system, with 10 numerical flags. His code included a numbered dictionary of 3,000 predefined words and sentences. The Admiralty adopted Popham's system to augment the 1799 signal book. The fleet left Britain on the 28th of August. Its destination was secret, but the concealed purpose was capturing the Cape of Good Hope. On the 28th of September, the fleet reached Madeira, and on the 30th, the true destination was revealed. On the 4th of October, they arrived at Bahia in Brazil, where water and provisions were taken. The fleet left at port on the 29th of November, and by the 3rd of January got to South Africa. On the 4th of January, the vessels moved to Table Bay in South Africa. The colours were hoisted and broadsides fired as signals of attack. The infantry were issued rounds and told to prepare for action. Baird and Popham searched for a landing site about 6 miles northwest of Cape Town, while Beresford disembarked in a shelter cove 60 miles north, and the fleet's ships moved inshore to bombard the enemy. With the bay secured, the infantry and marine battalions landed. At 4 a.m., Baird's army advanced down the road to Cape Town, and behind came 2 infantry brigades. The Dutch army of Janssens crumbled, and he ordered the retreat before defeat turned into disaster. The British forces reached the outskirts of Cape Town on the 9th of January. To spare the town and its civilian population from attack, the commandant, Casimir from Buffalo, sent out a white flag. He handed over the outer fortifications to Baird and signed the capitulation on the 10th of January. With the Dutch army still at large, Beresford ordered to pursue them. But Janssens gave up and conceded victory on the 18th of January, giving the British undisputed possession of the entire colony. Popham and Baird declared Cape Town an open port, and in April, the Volontaire, a 40-gun scout from Admiral Edouard Bouet Villamoise's fleet, sailed towards the Cape prior to the arrival of the ships of the line. The Dutch flag at the Cape was flown as a ruse to attract the enemy, and the frigate was captured. Popham spent March preparing to receive the rest of the enemy that never materialized, and by April the fear of attack waned. Remember how the previous plan for an American invasion was rejected? But Popham was convinced that even without an official sanction, Pitt would support him. So in 1807, with a powerful fleet at his disposal, the decision to launch a South American invasion was his own initiative, willfully disobeying orders. But London had ordered to forward the bulk of the troops to India. Thus, Sir David Baird had misgivings about accepting the plan. Yet by April was convinced and allowed his 6,000 infantry troops to be used. HMS Leader soon after left Table Bay for South America. Baird gave Popham the 71st Regiment of Infantry, 20 artillerymen with 6-pounders, 1,000 men, and 5 dismounted light dragoons of the 20th to attempt the invasion. Baird also promoted William Carr Beresford to general and designated him vice-governor of the zone if it was taken. On the 12th of April, the embarkation began with 3 ships of the line: Diadem, Reasonable, Diomede, plus the frigates Narcissus and Encounter, and 5 transports: Walter, Wellington, Melantho, Triton, and Ocean. Popham wrote to the Admiralty, making a plea for understanding, promising much honour and advantage to the Empire by his action, and hoped his request would not fall on deaf ears. At 4 p.m. on the 30th of April, Popham's fleet arrived off St. Helena, dropped anchor and spoke to Governor Patton, who gave them a detachment of 150 infantry, 100 artillerymen, and two 5.5-inch howitzers. Also, newspapers from London told of the death of Pitt, and Popham said, "I am now toiling under much speculative promise of approbation, that I proceed with little pleasure." On May the 27th, Popham transferred aboard HMS Narcissus, anxious for intelligence, having heard nothing from HMS Leader. On the 7th of June, on approach to the River Plate, a fog bank enveloped the ship, but had sight of the island of Lobos at 5 miles from the east bank. HMS Narcissus crept with the anchor cock-billed, hanging from the cathead, ready to drop at any moment, realizing that navigating the river was hazardous. The unpredictable tide and Pampero winds could force the water out to sea, causing it to fall rapidly, and it was also difficult to find solid anchorage on the muddy bottom. The image shows the River Plate area with the sandbanks and the location of Lobo Island, Maldonado, Montevideo, Quilmes, and Buenos Aires. On June the 8th, Popham surveyed Montevideo and spotting a schooner hoisted American colours, but on approach changed to British colours. It was Banquije, a Portuguese vessel with 75 crew. All were imprisoned on Narcissus, and among them the pilot, a Scot, William Russell, proved to be well-versed on the river shoals and hidden banks, a valuable capture. Russell also revealed Buenos Aires had a poor defence, and that the Viceroy had reinforced Montevideo on hearing of the British presence, and a caravan of silver from Upper Peru's mines had just arrived. Buenos Aires was at the time a large settlement, housing approximately 45,000 people. Yet the Spanish Viceroy Rafael Sobremonte was reluctant to give weapons to the Creole population, but when he learned of the British presence in the area, dispatched the remaining troops to Montevideo. When HMS Leader dropped anchor opposite Fort Santa Teresa, Viceroy Sobremonte was unconcerned, as it was only a single frigate. But in June, with a report of a British fleet off southern Brazil, and a week later as ships were sighted from Maldonado's watchtower, a small detachment of soldiers under Liniers was sent to Ensenada. Popham then sailed to the mouth of the river to rendezvous with the fleet, and a council of war was held on HMS Diadem. The participants comprised Beresford, Colonel Pack of the 71st, Dean, Ogilvy, Kennett, Captain Arbuthnot, and Ensign Gordon, representing the army, and the captains Donnelly, King, Rowley, Edwards, and Talbot. Beresford wanted to attack Montevideo, but Popham insisted on moving against Buenos Aires, as it was the capital, and its capture would lead to a domino effect. That evening, the infantry, artillery, marines, and sea battalion were transferred to the ships with the shallowest draft, Justina, Encounter, and Narcissus, while Diadem, Reasonable, and Diomede sailed to block Montevideo, and Popham took the smaller ships to Buenos Aires. Thus, Justina and Encounter led the way, guided by the Scottish pilot from the captured Portuguese brig. But as Narcissus grounded on Chico Bank, they transferred 6 18-pounders, shot, and 57 people to the Encounter. This then lightened the weight of the frigate that was hauled off at 6:30 a.m. Early on the 24th of June, the fleet anchored off Quilmes' shallow bay. Popham hoisted signals to clear for action, and that evening orders were circulated that the landing would begin at dawn. Later, at 9 p.m. on June the 24th, Thompson, captain of the port of Buenos Aires, informed the viceroy that numerous British warships were at anchor off Quilmes. HMS Encounter had dropped anchor a mile from shore and lowered its boats. A flotilla of 21 small craft and Beresford disembarked 1,641 men who waded ashore. In the darkness, the pipers and drummers of the 71st played to call men into position, and the ship's boats made the final journey, bringing the cannon and howitzers to the shore. At 7 a.m. on June the 26th, the British broke camp, and Colonel Park's men formed in two columns. Beresford ordered the 71st to take the right and the Marine Battalion the left, and Captain Ogilvy's 6-pounders were positioned at each flank, with the howitzers in the centre. But unfortunately, the guns then embedded to their axles. Beresford ordered to abandon the guns and proceed at the double. When the British were at 100 yards, two enemy cannons opened fire as the 71st fired 3 volleys of close-range musketry, fixed bayonets and charged. Pedro de Arce gave orders for the Spanish to retreat, and as they escaped, 2 of the cannons were left behind, which the British then used to fire upon the enemy. All these events were watched by Popham aboard HMS Narcissus through his telescope. At 4 p.m, Arce's cavalry arrived at Reducción, while the British 71st formed the vanguard, and the artillery at the rear made good progress traversing the undulating grassland. As they reached Santa Coloma, Beresford saw the bridge over the river in flames, and later, after crossing the Riachuelo Valley, found the structure entirely consumed by flames. Beresford waited until morning to start the attack, as the cannon and howitzers were positioned. Ogilvy soon found his range, when the 6-pounders and howitzers caused carnage through the Spanish ranks. The reply by the Spanish 2- and 4-pounders barely reached the British positions, and after a few more rounds, the men split up into smaller groups and left the field. Sensing victory, Beresford moved his men to the river bank, ordered sailors to swim across and capture the tethered Spanish boats on the other shore. As British troops made a pontoon and crossed the river, the Spanish fled, abandoning 3 cannon. By 11 a.m, the bulk of Beresford's men were formed upon the river's north bank. Having defeated the enemy twice in 2 days, and seeing no symptoms of opposition, a summons to surrender was sent using the Bostonian William Pius White as interpreter. By that time, Viceroy Sobremonte had already fled and left orders for José Quintana to take charge of the surrender. Beresford had done it. Buenos Aires was his. Beresford's army marched into town at 3 p.m. on the 27th of June, and at 7 a.m. next day, the British colours were hoisted on the fort. Popham, delighted at having witnessed the victory at Reducción, was rowed ashore on one of the frigate's boats. The main task now was securing funds to maintain the army and fleet. A garrison of 400, including the Royal Marines, the Sea Battalion, and Ogilvy's artillery, were stationed inside the fort. Popham took possession of 5 armed Spanish schooners and 4 gunboats. Beresford rode to Baird, asking for reinforcements from the Cape, and Lieutenant Groves was sent to take possession of Ensenada to have a post to fall back in case of problems. It was also revealed that Viceroy Sobremonte had been abandoned by his escort and left his treasure caravan at Luján. So Beresford ordered Captain Arbuthnot to set out in pursuit, and he found 684 pesos, 71 pigs of silver, and 72 pigs of copper, loaded on 19 wagons, which he escorted to Buenos Aires. On July the 13th, the 19 wagons of treasure arrived. The total prize money was 1,250,000 pesos. Byrd received £23,990, 5 shillings and 8 pence. Beresford, £11,995, 2 shillings and 10 pence. Popham got £5,997, 7 shillings and 5 pence, and the soldiers got £18 and 6 shillings. R. Dalton was appointed Royal Navy's liaison officer. Lieutenant Anderson was mayor of Buenos Aires, and Beresford secretary of the Cabildo, and he took up residency in the fort. Popham's thoughts then turned to the capture of Montevideo, and started organizing his fleet, whilst HMS Narcissus set sail for England with dispatches for the War Office and the Admiralty. Beresford wrote to Viscount Castlereagh, mentioning with confidence that all was well, and boasted the inhabitants of Buenos Aires desired to remain under the protection of His Britannic Majesty. But not all was as it seemed. As of 2 of the local factions, one was pleased with the situation, the other remained loyal to Carlos IV, yet both united by the presence of a mutual enemy, and as early as the end of June, 2 separate plots had been hatched to retake Buenos Aires. Soon after the invasion, the patriotic Catalans drafted a report for Vicente Huidoro, the governor of Montevideo, mentioning Beresford's numerical weakness and requesting military aid. Also, Liniers, who bombarded Popham's fleet from Ensenada on the 25th of June, decided to act. On 9th of July, the Catalans selected Centenac as their commander, and by the 15th of July, 1,900 men had enlisted, and over the next days, 2,000 unpaid volunteers were to form the reserve. In Montevideo, preparations were also underway, and a naval squadron was organized with 6 gunboats, 8 transports, and 6 armed sailing ships under Juan de la Concha. Rumors of the expedition reached Beresford, who was also concerned about the rate of desertions among his supporters, as the malaise even spread to the 71st. Beresford responded with a proclamation threat to execute any locals involved, and on the 28th of July learned that Liniers' force had arrived at Colonia. HMS Encounter on the 30th performed a reconnaissance and dropped anchor 10 miles off Colonia, sighting a considerable number of vessels in the bay. Liniers ordered de la Concha to attack, and HMS Talbot, a British Royal Navy 18-gun sloop of war, opened fire towards one of the Spanish schooners armed with a 32-pounder. But HMS Talbot, by 4:45 p.m., had to break off the engagement, being in some difficulties and unable to maneuver due to a contrary wind. That afternoon, Beresford learned that the volunteers from Buenos Aires were mobilized, and 1,050 men from Luján were encamped a mile to the west. At 8:30, Beresford ordered the 71st to advance and when at 100 yards, Ogilvy's 6-pounders opened fire, and Pack ordered the 71st to fire by companies. But the bulk of the Spaniards mounted their horses and fled. By the 5th of August, Liniers had consolidated his position, as his army swelled to over 2,000 and was engrossed by Sobremontes' 2,500 men raised in Córdoba. Then intelligence advised the British of an enemy attack against the fort, so Pack mounted a strong guard in the Plaza Mayor. By that time, Beresford began to countenance defeat, as the Royal Navy officers were doing their utmost to engage the enemy, and Popham, safe aboard HMS Leader, was happy to leave the army and marines to their fate. On the morning of the 9th of August, Liniers advanced and sent a letter to Beresford demanding his surrender, but on learning of his rebuttal, Captain Agustini attacked El Retiro when the Redcoats' position was overrun, and by the time Ogilvy arrived, it was all over. The Royal Marines and sailors of Popham's Sea Battalion garrisoned the fort and deployed 7 cannon. That evening, the Spanish cut off British communications with the interior, and Liniers set up camp in El Retiro. In the fort, Beresford and Pack discussed the possibility of an attack, but several others had their doubts. At 10 a.m., Liniers ordered Agustini to engage the British shipping with the 18-pounder, and Popham came ashore and discussed with Beresford details of a possible evacuation. Under the cover of darkness, the Spanish occupied the churches in the Plaza Mayor, while the Bostonian William Pugh White tried to instigate negotiations and agree a bloodless withdrawal. Pueyrredon received the letter and proposed a meeting at 9 a.m. in Catalina Square. By midday, Beresford realized his position was untenable, and by 12:30, the focus of the battle was on Plaza Mayor. Beresford ordered Lieutenant Murray to counterattack, but it proved futile. By 1 p.m., Beresford realized the game was up. His guns were down to the last few rounds. 3 of his officers and 46 men were dead and 100 wounded. As the pipers and drummers played the retreat, the British ensign was lowered and a flag of truce raised in its place. But Captain Quintana begged Beresford to defuse the protest by raising a Spanish flag instead, and the Major General reluctantly agreed. At 3 p.m., Beresford left the fort for the Plaza Mayor, where Liniers embraced him and agreed the British would be treated as if they had surrendered with full honours. The officers would be allowed to retain their swords, while the men would be imprisoned for their own safety. At 4 p.m., Beresford returned to the fort and addressed his men. The humiliation was complete. The men were marched to prison, and at the gates, officers were separated from the men. Watching through his telescope aboard HMS Leader, Popham was concerned. The capture was a disaster, and with Pitt dead, he knew his enemies in Westminster would take full advantage of his humiliation. After the British defeat, a power vacuum was created in Buenos Aires. Armed mobs roamed the streets, and revolutionary ideas were in the air. Half of the rank and file of the British remained imprisoned, and Popham's fleet had disappeared downriver. Beresford and Liniers were discussing the terms of surrender, and copies of the capitulation were printed in English and Spanish. But reports of Sobremontes' return incensed the Porteños, who accused him of cowardice and banned his entrance into town. Pueyrredon was dispatched to intercept him and communicate the risk of being lynched by the mob if he returned. Meanwhile, at Buenos Aires, Beresford in the fort blamed Popham's avarice for his misfortune, and by 14th of August, Popham transferred his flag to HMS Diadem and sailed to Montevideo, where he attempted to secure Beresford's release. Popham issued Governor Huidoro with a thinly veiled threat proposing an exchange of prisoners, but insulted by the Commodore's tone, an evasive response was penned, while Popham ordered 2 transports to sail to Buenos Aires and pick up the troops. The transports arrived on the 17th of August, but the Cabildo pressured Liniers to go back on his word. Thus, with no definite timetable for their departure, the British were concerned and began to despair. Beresford met with Liniers as he proposed to embark the British at night at a place out of sight of the townspeople, but the plan was foiled, as the Cabildo threatened Liniers would be arrested if he carried out the plan. On 27th of August, the Cabildo announced the transfer of the British rank and file to the interior, while the fate of the officers remained in the balance. In late August, Liniers and the Cabildo began raising a new army in case the British attacked again, and by October 8,500 men were under arms, while 120 miles east, Popham remained locked in dispute with Huidoro. After 44 letters had been exchanged concerning the fate of British prisoners, with no visible solution, the Commodore's mood was darkening. Meanwhile, by 28th of August, Popham learned the identity of his new masters in Westminster, with whom he began an ingratiating correspondence. On the 1st of September, the Cabildo's version of the capitulation was published and distributed, stating the British troops would be sent to the interior and the officers on their parole to Europe. Popham then tightened the blockade of Montevideo, and on September the 15th, HMS Reasonable from Rio de Janeiro joined his fleet laden with provisions, together with the newly arrived HMS Medusa, as the first of Byrd's 3 waves of long-awaited reinforcements from the Cape of Good Hope. Aboard the flotilla were the 38th 811 strong, 2 troops of the 20th Light Dragoons, and 103 of the 54th Foot. In command was Colonel Blackhouse, with plans to attack Montevideo. 2 ships of the line, the frigates and gunboats, would position close to the town's south gate, and the ships ran parallel to the shore. Several British ships were hit by the Spanish when Popham called off the attack and proposed instead to go for Maldonado. His ships anchored a quarter of a mile from the beach, and the 38th clambered onto boats and rowed ashore. As they descended from the sand dunes, Martinez ordered the artillery to open fire, and as they got closer, discharged a howitzer with grape. But after a few minutes, at 9 p.m, the town was won, and the British flag hoisted. Popham then demanded capitulation, as Agustin de Loris conceded, and an officer went to San Carlos to demand its surrender. The ships spent several months in Maldonado, until HMS Simpson arrived with Charles Sterling to replace Popham, and later Lieutenant S. Ahmuti arrived on 11th of December, and his reinforcements were due in 3 weeks. Popham finally returned home on 26th of December. Ahmuti and Sterling then agreed to abandon Maldonado for Montevideo, as 3 ships, 4 frigates, 3 sloops, 4-gun brigs and 40 transports sailed west to assemble off Flores Island, and HMS Lida carried a dispatch for the Viceroy to surrender, but the Spanish numerical strength gave them courage to rebuff the summons. On the 15th of January, orders were distributed for the landing and disembarkation by the divisions. At 10:30 a.m., the crews of the landing boats pulled for shore, but Sobremontes' troops did not resist until 2 p.m., and by sunset remained frozen on the heights, when Huidoro asked for reinforcements from Buenos Aires. At daybreak, the British moved in 2 columns, having hauled some guns over the dunes. By 6 a.m., Sobremontes' 2,500 troops confronted the enemy, but Allende's cavalry subsequently fled, leaving the infantry exposed to full British fire and allowed them to advance to Montevideo. Halting at 2 miles from the massive town's wall, built of stone, 4 feet thick and 15 feet high, with a fort named Citadel. Inside the town, the citizens were in uproar, furious at the Viceroy's retreat, and at 6 a.m. on the 20th of January, the Spanish marched out of town in 2 columns and encountered the British outposts, who managed to repulse them. Lecoq ordered a retreat, but the carnage was dreadful, and by 8:30 it was over. Next morning, Captain Roche sent a ceasefire proposal under terms of surrender, but Ahmouti decided to breach the wall of the citadel, and on February the 3rd at 2 a.m. the weakest part of the city wall came under heavy bombardment by the Royal Navy ships under Admiral Charles Sterling. In Montevideo, the situation was desperate. Some suggested surrender, but Huidoro insisted they fight on. Yet Ahmouti briefed his officers for an assault, directed by Colonel Gore Brown, and that night the British took up their positions. After the assault started, Captain Rennie of the 40th located the breach, and the 87th, along with a company of the 95th, scaled the wall under fire of 6 cannon. The defenders promptly surrendered by 4:45, when the Union Jack was hoisted on the battlements. The gates were opened, and the 87th stormed inside. Organized resistance had collapsed, and spreading through town, the Redcoats rounded up thousands of prisoners. Huidoro surrendered by 5:30 and was taken prisoner, together with Lecoq, Arce, Viana, and Quintana. The storming of Montevideo was the bloodiest event of the campaign. Before the gun smoke had even dissipated, the streets of Montevideo returned to a state of comparative tranquility, and after the 2,000 prisoners had been confined, a punishment parade was held in the main square. Also, on 7th of February, the port was opened to ships of all nations, which led to a dizzying quantity of trade, as over 2,000 merchants and merchant sailors arrived. Ahmouti, meanwhile, concentrated on extending his control into the interior, and launched his second major offensive to capture Colonia del Sacramento, where his troops easily landed and their commander simply surrendered. On the 26th of April, the 600 Spanish and Creoles captured at Montevideo were embarked on HMS Lancaster and Howe, and 9 army transports, all bound for England, but many would die of scurvy on the voyage. 2 weeks after the departure, on the 10th of May, HMS Thisbe arrived off Montevideo, and on board was Lieutenant General John Whitelock, the newly appointed Commander-in-Chief in the River Plate. William Windham, Secretary of State for War, ordered Whitelock to recover Buenos Aires without alienating the locals, reflecting the belief that South America was desperate to shake off Spanish rule. Whitelock's next task was to choose a landing area, and he favoured Ensenada. So, on the 19th of May, Burke, on HMS Fly, went to inspect the area. An overland route from Ensenada to Buenos Aires was selected, along a series of heights between 2 and 6 miles inland that allowed the carrying of cannon and led to high ground at El Retiro. Wyndham also appointed Major General R. Crawford, a large fleet and 8,000 troops divided into 4 brigades that departed on the 17th of June. Sailing through the night, the fleet threaded its way between the Chico and Ortiz sandbanks and at 4 p.m. on the 25th of June dropped anchor off Ensenada. Bad weather prevented the landing that only took place on the 28th of June. The Spanish were now well prepared and had 9,000 men under arms, with over 60 cannon, howitzers and mortars. A new battery was built to protect El Retiro, and the infantry were regularly drilled. In June, preparations even stepped up due to reports of the British fleet being on the move and heading for Ensenada. On the 28th of June, Admiral Murray signalled disembarkation. Crawford was first to land, and by 11 a.m. Ensenada was secured. The march began badly when conditions got worse as the marsh gave way to a bog. There were 50 miles of sodden ground to Buenos Aires, where Liniers had deployed his forces by the Galvez Bridge. Whitelock ordered Gower to march to Reducción, and the Spanish opened fire while the Redcoats were still out of range, moving towards the bridge to outflank Liniers. As they descended into Riachuelo Valley, where 600 enemy horsemen had formed up, Gower and Crawford were met with a shower of grape, shot and musketry, so Crawford advanced against the enemy's centre while Captain Elder swept round their flank. The first Spanish battery was overrun in an instant, but the infantry and second battery opened fire. At first, the Spanish resisted, as Pio de Gana attempted to outflank Crawford's line, but when de Gana was killed, Major G. Elder's company poured repeated volleys into the Spanish side that routed and fled to the northwest. The British troops hunted the enemy, and by 7:30 Crawford called off the pursuit, when nothing then stood between his troops and the centre of town, where Martín de Alzaga began preparing the defence by pooling the troops in the Plaza Mayor to draw the enemy into urban combat along the narrow streets of the city. The Plaza Mayor was fortified and barricades built. 2,000 troops guarded El Retiro, and the citizens took positions on the rooftops. A second line of defence was built 3 to 4 blocks away. The British were opposed by 6,000 men that perceived their every move from the turrets of Buenos Aires. At 5 a.m., 14 columns of British soldiers were led to the starting line, and by 6 a.m., all columns were in position. At 6:35 a.m., as Captain Augustus Fraser fired the 3 signal cannon, the hidden Spanish and Creoles opened fire. Musketry, grenades, stones, as well as bricks and clay pots filled with flaming pitch, all were hurled to the enemy from the rooftops. The 87th began their advance, but were met with 24-pounder fire. In El Retiro, the entire section of the Grenadiers was cut down by fire and a discharge of grape. The 38th, at 300 yards, also came under fire, while the 88th, on the other side of Plaza Mayor, had difficulty in forcing its way into San Miguel's church, as the Spanish opened fire from close range, with the Redcoats not able to hide. At 200 meters in Santa Lucia Street, Major Vandeleur also took heavy casualties. while at the corner of Santo Domingo and San Martin streets, a wave of fire erupted as the British advanced. The whole of the company were either killed or disabled. Crawford's advance crossed the Correo, Catedral, and San Martin streets, and as he entered the fray, Pack and Cadogan's men were being decimated. The British attack had mixed results. Major Nichols occupied the Residencia. Crawford reached the bank of the river, and the 88th had suffered horrendously, moving to El Retiro under heavy fire. The 38th also advanced and attacked the north of El Retiro, but with no cover. The attack was a bloody failure. In Plaza Mayor, the 88th situation was deteriorating, as all Spaniards joined in the killing with rifles, grenades, homemade incendiaries, and pouring boiling water on the enemy. Also, the 88th left wing was in trouble at a high parapet wall and ditch that turned into a death trap. But Whitelock, 2 miles away, remained unaware of the carnage of his troops. By 10:30, the situation was desperate. Low on ammunition, with 4 privates killed, 5 officers and 82 rank and file wounded. At 10:50, a Spanish officer approached with a flag of truce, and as soon as the British stopped firing, the Spaniards occupied the most dominating positions. Lieutenant H. Cadogan realized the game was up, and at 11 a.m. waved the white flag. Also at 11, Martin Sedabert brought a light gun forward from the Plaza Mayor and opened fire on Major Vandeleur's position that added to the carnage. So it was agreed that they had to surrender, and waving a white handkerchief, ordered his men to cease fire. When Duff, fearful the other British columns had withdrawn, also began to consider surrender. At 11:50, the enemy was admitted to discuss terms. At midday, Colonel Elio approached under a flag of truce, and after confirming the capitulation of the 88th and claiming he had 1,000 prisoners, demanded Lumley's surrender. Crawford was also informed the 88th and other corps were taken prisoner, that his attacks failed, and that he should surrender. On the other side of Plaza Mayor, Lieutenant Trotter's men burst out of the gates of Santo Domingo, and the Spanish received them with a volley of fire. All those men in the first 2 ranks were killed or wounded, and even Trotter succumbed. In the western suburbs, Whitelock was unaware of the surrender of Cadogan, Duff, and Vandeleur, when Crawford also concluded his only option was to surrender. At 3:15, a flag of truce was waved at the enemy. Colonel Elio wanted an unconditional surrender. Crawford agreed, asking his troops to lay down their arms and march out of the gates. In the town centre, the prisoners were herded into a walled courtyard. The officers were taken to Linier's quarters and showed the draft of the surrender proposal for Whitelock. The prisoners would be released in exchange for the evacuation of all British troops from Buenos Aires, on condition they sail immediately for England. Of the 6,000 British troops, 311, including 15 officers, had died. 15 officers and 622 men had been wounded, and 3 officers and 205 men were missing. Ahmouti held 700 prisoners, while Liniers had 1,611 in the town centre. at 8 a.m., a messenger with a letter from Liniers and Alzaga reiterated the surrender of the 88 and announced the capture of Crawford and Pack's columns. The note included the terms of surrender and a threat that if such proposals are not agreed, the safety of the prisoners could not be guaranteed. The British, thinking of a second offensive, said the letter would be forwarded to Whitelock, who called the Council of War to consider the reply, but proposed a 24-hour ceasefire. With the surrender terms rebuffed, Liniers ordered to take Residencia, and Lieutenant Lach advanced and opened fire on the British position. At 12:30, the British replied, opening fire on the fort with 24-pounders from the gunboats, but Agostini's gunners found the range and hit the gunboats that upped anchors and left. At 1 p.m., Whitelock arrived at El Retiro, met with Gower and Ahmouti, and reflected that more than half its troops were killed, wounded or imprisoned, and the rest were fatigued and exposed. Also mentioned was the difficulty of obtaining ordnance stores, and it was concluded that if better surrender terms could be obtained, they should accept the outcome. Whitelock had made up his mind and signalled the gunboat captains to silence their guns, and a flag of truce was hoisted on the bullring at 3 p.m. The British wanted A. to remain in Montevideo for 4 months, B. no disruption to supplies, C. that the troops be allowed 10 days to evacuate, and that commerce on the River Plate would be open and free. Liniers agreed to the demands, and Gower returned to El Retiro at 7 p.m. with the details, where the reaction was anger and disbelief. On the morning of the 7th of July, Whitelock showed Burke the terms and notice of the truce sent to Corrales. Once Rear Admiral George Murray signed, Captain Whittingham was sent to bring Liniers to El Retiro. By mid-morning, the prisoners got to El Retiro. The 45th arrived from the Residencia, and hostages to be left in Buenos Aires were chosen. The evacuation began on the 9th of July, as troops were rowed to the transports. HMS Saracen departed for England with Ahmouti, Crawford, Burke, and Holland. By the 12th of July, the evacuation was complete, and on 14th of July, the fleet anchored off Montevideo and published a proclamation ordering all British citizens to be ready to leave by 6th of September. The last of the sick and wounded left Buenos Aires on the 25th of September. The leading ships of Whitelock's army touched at Spithead on the 5th of November, and Whitelock took a carriage to Whitehall to make his report. On the 14th of September, the Times termed the defeat the greatest disaster felt by the country, and the public demanded an enquiry. On the 28th of January 1808, Whitelock took the stand alone and was charged with 4 counts. He pleaded not guilty. The trial lasted 31 days, and on the 18th of March, he was pronounced guilty on 3 charges. His punishment was long debated and was sentenced to be cashiered out of the army and declared totally unfit to serve His Majesty in any military capacity whatsoever. Captain Elder acted as a witness in the court-martial after the failed invasion of Buenos Aires. This signalled the end of his career, whilst Popham emerged from the affair with his prospects undiminished, and in 1817 was given command of the Jamaica Squadron. News of the capture of Buenos Aires reached England on 12 September 1807. When the frigate arrived at Portsmouth, the celebrations began. Beresford and Popham's dispatches were delivered to Downing Street on the 15th of September. The Chamber of the Board of Trade met to discuss the commercial opportunities. While the city overjoyed at the success, the government's reaction was mixed. The public and mercantile support was widespread, and Popham enjoyed the backing of several politicians, while others wanted Popham and Baird punished, but the War Office and Admiralty agreed they would not ruin Popham on his return. Much later, Popham was censured by a court-martial for leaving his station. Despite his embarrassment, the City of London presented him with a Sword of Honour for his endeavours to open new markets.